Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back to this the last tutorial on the series of learning as part of your Introductory to Psychology module. So for this last tutorial, I've wanted to focus more specifically on concepts that are directly related to language and language acquisition. So I really hope you enjoyed this one, and it's been a pleasure making these videos for you. And we are gonna finish these tutorials tackling verbal behavior and how the behavior that is related to language is approached from a psychological perspective. And these tutorial's objectives are to explore what verbal behavior is, what we mean by that, and what types of verbal behaviors, or in other words, verbal operants, exist. We are only going to touch on some of the verbal operants that have been defined. And the reason for this is that the ones that we have here are the ones that have been most used in practice. So we are going to be talking about echoics, transcription, textual behavior, dictation taking, text, commands, and intraverbals. So we are going to explain each of these as we progress through the slide. And we are going to finish with equivalence relations, which is a way in which emergent behavior takes place. So we are going to start with a quick review of some of the key concepts related to both classical and operant conditioning that we covered in the previous tutorials. And we are going to arrange those two types of conditionings based on the elements that correspond to the antecedent, the response, and the consequence, just to ease comparison. So we start with classical or Pavlovian conditioning. And the important thing to notice in classical conditioning is the relationship between the antecedent stimuli. So in classical conditioning, the key relationship is between a pairing or an association between the stimuli before a particular response, or before the response is elicited by one of the stimuli present before the response. And we contrast that to operant conditioning developed by Skinner, in which the key relationship in this case is not that among the stimuli in the antecedent or before the response, but is between the response and what happens after. In other words, between the response and the consequence. And the relevance of focusing on these key relationships is that if we were to decondition or reverse or change some of the behavior that has been acquired by either classical or operant conditioning, we would have to tackle that key relationship. We'll have to break that key relationship. So in other words, if we want to break a classical conditioning or response that has been acquired via classical conditioning, then we'll have to dissociate or stop that relationship between stimuli before eliciting a particular response. On the other hand, if we wanted to change a behavior that has been acquired via operant conditioning, we would have to focus on changing or breaking the relationship between the response and the consequence, because remember, the consequence is what is maintaining that particular response. So comparing these two types of conditioning based on the elements present in antecedent, response, and consequence can be quite useful. These three elements is what we call the three-termed contingency. Antecedents played an important role in behavior, as there cannot be behavior without an environmental context, and features of the environment or changes in these will correlate with the frequency that a behavior will be reinforced or punished. So, for example, in the presence of parents, swearing is likely to be punished, whereas in the presence of friends, it could actually be reinforced. And that brings us to the concept of discrimination or discriminative stimulus, conventionally referred to as SD, as we see here on this slide. And just to recap, discrimination is when we respond in the presence of one stimulus but not of another one. And it is a concept that is inversely related to generalization, as we saw in the previous tutorial. We normally say that a discriminative stimulus sets the occasion for, or occasions, the behavior which is then reinforced or punished. And whether it is reinforced or punished, then we'll be referring to the consequences of what happens in the after the response. In operant conditioning, it is the contingency between the behavior and the consequences that controls behavior. Colloquially, one would say that whereas consequences or reinforcement, punishment, and extinction control the frequency of a behavior, a SD, or a discriminative stimulus, controls the likelihood of emitting that behavior. And finally, we come to establishing or motivational operations. And any operation that changes the status of a stimulus, either as a reinforcer or a punisher, it's referred to as an establishing operation or a motivating operation. Deprivation and satiation are examples of this, but we'll touch on some of these concepts in more depth as we continue. So language is behavior. So we usually make assumptions about language that we would not make about other behaviors. When we talk about verbal behavior as opposed to language, verbal behavior as a term is emphasizing activity, whereas language emphasizes a possession, as if we had a faculty. And we use words as though they were the objects that they refer to rather than a behavioral event. So, for example, the word red does not have a color. We tend to think same reference equals the same thing, but that is not always the case. So, for example, when I say hello, it's not a case of referent and thing. And we often fail to distinguish between spoken and written words. And even though both could be classified as language or linguistic stimuli, whether it is spoken or written are different responses. They differ physically and spatially. They also differ in terms of time. It takes longer to write down linguistic stimuli than to just utter it or make the sounds corresponding to them. They also take place in different contexts. But more importantly, they are controlled by different types of consequences, as we will see later. Now, outside academic contexts in particular, we think that words carry meanings. So when somebody asks, "How was the weekend?" we assume that there is a meaning intrinsic in that statement and that the other person is understanding that meaning. The problem is that meanings are no identifiable events. So in other words, there's nothing about that particular statement that would indicate that that meaning is actually theirs. Words do not refer to things. Words only ever refer people to things. Words and other verbal behaviors are therefore always performative. Because of these properties, which are formed through verbal communities or culture, we're able to talk about green elephants, Martians, and black holes. And those are, for example, things that wouldn't have a physical reference, because the only truth of the word is the effect they have on people, not an effect relating to elephants or black holes. And if someone gets our meaning, in other words, that simply means that they are behaving in the way we expect them to. So traditional approaches to language, such as linguistics, have tended to focus on the structure of language, that is, grammar, etc., rather than the function of language, or in other words, as I mentioned earlier, on the effect that language can have on an environment, and in this case it would be our social environment. And focusing on the structure of language doesn't help us to identify the circumstances giving rise to a particular sentence or to a verbal episode, or the effects or the consequences that it produces on the speaker or the listener, etc. Of course, these other approaches to language are totally valid, but from a scientific perspective, it gives us little to work with when it comes to explaining how and why language occurs. For example, consider the sentence, "The psychologist talked to the chimpanzee." From a grammatical point of view, this sentence is the same whether it is spoken by an observer of an interaction between a human and an ape, written as memorized by a student in an examination, heard by a passing child in a psychiatric ward, or read as an arbitrary example in a lecture. However, these behaviors are quite different. So in his book Verbal Behavior, Skinner sought to provide a behavioral account of language that addressed some of these issues. So he described different types of verbal behavior based on the antecedent conditions that gave rise to a particular response, the properties of these responses, and the relationship between antecedent conditions and the response, as well as the consequences for the response. Now, 2 years later, in 1955, Noam Chomsky wrote a highly influential critique to verbal behavior. However, Chomsky's critique attacked behaviorism itself rather than Skinner's use of behaviorism to explain language. Now, critically, neither Skinner nor any other noted behaviorist responded to the critique at the time, and those who saw this presumed that Chomsky must have been correct in his criticisms. When one reads Skinner's autobiography, he explains that when he saw Chomsky's critique, he just didn't feel the need to reply to the paper that he had written because he clearly had misunderstood the whole perspective that he was taking. So Skinner's defined behavior as a behavior that is reinforced through the mediation of another person's behavior. In this case, the verbal response, "open the door," can produce the reinforcer of a door opening by somebody else. And that brings us to our first verbal operant, which is that of echoic behavior. And it's defined as a response that generates a sound pattern similar to that of the stimulus. So it makes reference to that basic ability that humans have to imitate or replicate sounds around them. So for example, we have a stimulus, the sound mum, and we have a response that matches or corresponds to that sound pattern. However, that relationship is not as easy as it seems, even though the antecedent stimulus is a speech pattern such as mum, and we have the consequence of that sound. The response consists of the articulations and the coordinated movements of the vocal apparatus. Even though the articulations produce the sound similar to the stimulus, and that's the defining relationship in an echoic, the movement themselves are not sounds. So as echoic behavior is behavior reinforced based on the similarity of the child's speech to the speech of another source, so between the stimulus and the response, the sound of the child's speech really is called the response product. And we do this distinction in order to differentiate the overall reinforcement for the echoic behavior, that is the movements, the muscle movements of the mouth, and the reinforcement of the sound production. So how do echoic behavior develops? There's first bubbling that produces a range of speech sounds. So this is when when babies are starting to generate sounds. And only native sounds then are reinforced by caregivers. So parents are more likely to respond to sounds that assimilates their language. Bubbling then evolves into self-repetitions, And again, only native sounds will tend to be reinforced by those people who are listening based on how similar it is to the language they speak. Hearing his or her own voice becomes reinforcing through pairing with primary reinforcement. So this is the sensation that it generates, also referred to in some contexts as sensorial reinforcement. And through induction and generalization, the baby begins to repeat the sounds of others. So there's also imitative behavior involved in here, of course. So our next verbal operant is transcription, and unlike echoics, the critical feature of transcription are not the physical properties. Instead, the verbal history of the person behaving must allow them to identify the functional units of the language being transcribed. They must understand the language. For example, a Chinese calligrapher could copy an English text without any understanding of what he or she is copying. And in this case, that would not be the transcription. So this is what we are referring to when we talked about the verbal history of the person. A person whose verbal history doesn't include English could not said to be transcribing unless he's understanding what he is copying. In other words, unless he's able to respond to that stimuli that is expected within a verbal community. It is the correspondence then between these verbal units that defines transcription. The classical example then would be the teacher who is providing some verbal stimulus to be copied and the child who is reproducing it. So our antecedent stimulus is a visual stimulus, and the response is also a visual verbal stimulus. But as in echoic behavior, the actual response of writing is not formally similar to the antecedent, but rather the consequences of hand movements are established through training. So the history of the person in the verbal environment is key for this verbal operant, as well as the others. Next, we have a textual behavior set to take place when a stimulus sets the occasion for corresponding vocal responses. So in this case, we have a written visual stimulus. That is, our antecedent is a visual verbal stimulus, and the response product is the sound that corresponds to it based on our verbal community. And the response per se would be the movements of the vocal apparatus. But the defining characteristic, as in the definition, is the correspondence between the visual stimulus and the corresponding sound. And next, dictation taken is when an auditory stimulus occasions a written response. Remember that the correspondence between these the auditory stimulus and the written word products are dependent on that learning history of the person. So for example, a Spanish native speaker, and that is one who does not speak English, when he or she hears the utter word lecture, is more likely to think of reading because lecture sounds similar to lectura. And in part, if we go back to textual behavior, the written word lecture could also make this Spanish speaker think of lectura, as in reading, because of how similar it is to his language, in other words, to his history of learning in his verbal community. And so we have the case when we are writing letters. For example, we have an antecedent auditory stimulus and a visual verbal response, even though the response per se are actually hand movements. Okay, to review then, these distinct verbal operants underline the importance of training each mode of linguistic response. And I suppose the importance of this is evident in a clinical practice when a child is able to write, for example, words, but he's unable to speak them. So the intervention would have to be specific to the behavior that is being manifested. And even though for a verbally competent adult, hello and hello could look the same, functionally speaking, These correspondences are learned and are absent in young children. For example, a child taught to name written letters can write letters given the name without further training. And again, this highlights the relevance it has for clinical practice. The next verbal operand then is tacting. The previous 4 operands are the basis for a linguistic repertoire, but language also needs to come under a control of a stimuli that is not necessarily verbal. A tact then is a verbal response that is made more likely by the presence of a non-verbal stimulus, and as such, a tact is a verbal discriminative response. That is, reinforcement for a specific response is conditional on the presence of a specific environmental stimulus. So here we have an example, an antecedent condition or an SD as a discriminative stimulus. In this case, we have a car. And we could have a response corresponding to the sound car, and that would have been reinforced in a verbal community. So the defining relation would be between that discriminative stimulus, in this case this vehicle, and the sound, and any other responses, that is any other sounds corresponding to other objects, would not be reinforced, and that would lead to extinction. That is, the probability of uttering other sounds that conventionally do not refer to cars would not take place. But tacting could also take the form of a written form, or look daddy, look daddy. So we are breaking away from that physical correspondence, and we are moving into the functionality of language and what is reinforced within a verbal community. It may be tempting to say that in a tag the response refers to, mentions, announces, or talks about and describes its stimulus, but the essential relation between response and the controlling stimulus is precisely the same as in echoic, textual, or intraverbal behavior. The only useful functional relation is expressed in the statement that the presence of a given stimulus, in this case that vehicle, raises the probability of occurrence of a given form response. Another example belonging to what Skinner would have defined as metonymical extension would be when a child that is accustomed to seeing an orange on the breakfast table, and an orange being a non-verbal stimulus, when on a given morning the orange, for example, is missing, the child says orange. In this case, we do not need to say that the child perceives the absence of the orange. The response is evoked by the breakfast table with all its familiar features and by other stimuli appropriate to the time of the day. Oranges have frequently accompanied this stimuli, and the response orange has been reinforced in their presence. A similar metonymical extension might occur in the other direction as a result of the same history. For example, an orange seen for the first time under other circumstances might evoke the response breakfast. Obviously, a more sophisticated speaker would say more under such circumstances, and that is faced with the breakfast table without an orange, he may ask no orange, or faced with an orange in the absence of a breakfast table or at a different time of the day, he may say that orange reminds me of breakfast. But this would refer to other types of verbal behavior, also known as autocletics. So a tag does not have to be always controlled by an object if any property of the environment changes predictively with reinforcement. And this brings us to abstract tags, our next verbal operand. As the name implies, a tag may be reinforced in the presence of a common property of many stimuli, such as the color or their size. And an example of this would be if as an antecedent condition we have an array of stimuli, so those are our discriminative stimuli, and we have a response that is tacting an abstracted property from these elements, and that would be reinforced in certain circumstances. So that would be our defining characteristic. Any other responses would be extinguished or become less frequent as they are not reinforced. Our next verbal operand then would be months. And the tact provides one way in which the nonverbal environment may occasion verbal behavior, but usually we use verbal behavior to get people to do things for us or to get a specific response in our social environment. A month then specifies its reinforcer. That is, specific reinforcement is provided for a specific response. You can think of a month as the reverse of a tact. In a tact, for example, a specific antecedent produces a specific response. In a month, specific consequences reinforces a specific response. So if I want to get an apple, the consequence, I ask for an apple response. So what are the controlling variables of a month? In a month, the response is reinforced by a specified consequence and is therefore under the functional control of relevant conditions of deprivation or aversive stimulation. So deprivation, for example, would be the technical definition of motivation in this context. So when we are thirsty, for example, we would respond to that condition by asking, "Can I have some water, please?" Now, changes in the environment that change the motivation of a person are called establishing or motivational operations, as I mentioned at the beginning of this lecture. Dehydration, exercise, weather, those are conditions that would increase the probability of demanding some water from a social stimulus in our environment. So in this case, we have a response, which is ball, and the consequence, which is obtaining the object that has conventionally been referred to as a ball. Other responses then would be extinguished. Just as with the first four verbal operands, tact and months are functionally independent, and that means that they must be trained separately in young kids. Lamer and Holland in 1985 demonstrated this experimentally. They taught children to request where to place an object or a toy, whether they wanted it on the left or on the right. And later, the same children were not necessarily able to describe or say where the objects were on the left or on the right. So even though they learned command with respect to left and right, they were not able to tact this. And children who were trained to tact the position of objects were not able to use this as commands to request that an object were placed to the right side or left. The last verbal operand then that we'll cover in this lecture is introverbals. The previous verbal operands that we have examined were based on correspondence between stimuli and the responses. So in echoic behavior, for example, we have an auditory stimulus and a vocal response that corresponds to it. However, in more complex interactions, we won't find those correspondences. In this example, we may have an antecedent, where do you live? That question, and as a and the response could be something completely different in the way it sounds and in the way it is written, such as I live in Galway. Now, Skinner describes this type of operand as when a verbal stimulus evokes a response that does not have a point-to-point correspondence with the verbal stimulus. So 2 plus 2 demands a response of 4, even though 4 sounds and is written differently than 2 plus 2. So one of the additional advantages of looking at verbal operands as independent behaviors is the fact that we can not only treat those specific behaviors, but also we are in a position to identify them based on their characteristics, or in other words, their controlling variables. So when faced with a verbal behavior, we could try to follow a decision tree or flow to identify what type of verbal operand we are dealing with. If the verbal response has a motivating operation, then we could say that the operand is at least part amand. So remember, an example of motivating operations would be a state of deprivation. We could also ask if there's a particular stimulus that is controlling the form of the response. If the answer to that is yes, is this particular discriminative stimulus non-verbal? If it's non-verbal, then that verbal operand or the verbal episode that we are examining is at least attacked. Is the discriminative stimulus verbal? On the other hand, then now is there a point-to-point correspondence between the verbal discriminative stimulus and the response? If not, then we're talking about an intraverbal. If yes, then is there a formal similarity between the verbal discriminative stimulus and the response? If yes, then the operand must be echoic or copying a text. If not, then the operand must be textual or transcription. So this decision flow could give us a starting point where we are trying to examine a verbal episode and determine what type of verbal operand is it that we are dealing with. With this in mind, next we're going to watch a video and just try to think about whether we can call what we are going to watch verbal behavior.
Can pigeons read? This one gives every indication, because he's been taught to distinguish between two words and to behave appropriately. He's learned his different response to each sign by being rewarded with food. So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment. It's one it quickly grew used to. One piece of behavior, pecking a colored disc, was measured on a graph.
And you can reinforce with food, but you don't reinforce every time. You're perhaps every 10th time, or perhaps only once every minute or something like that. There are a very large number of schedules. A pigeon can become a pathological gambler. The fact that we found that out with pigeons and could prove it by removing and changing the schedule.
Take a moment to identify whether the behavior of the pigeon could actually be regarded as a type of verbal behavior, according to the taxonomy of verbal operands that we have covered so far. And this table provides a summary and an easy reference to look at the controlling or antecedent conditions of each of verbal operand, what form can the response take, and the relation between the antecedent stimulus and the stimulus product. The leftmost column of this table lists the different type of verbal operands. The next column shows the type of antecedent conditions that controls the behavior. The next column would show the form the response can take according to each verbal operand. The fourth column describes what is the relation of the antecedent stimulus to the stimulus product. The fifth column specifies the reinforcing stimulus, indicated here by an S+ symbol, where GCR stands for Generalized Conditioned Reinforcer. And the rightmost column would just provide a sort of example for each of these verbal operands. Take a couple of minutes to study this table. In what follows, you will be presented with a series of video clips, and I want you to try to identify which verbal operand you are looking at in each of those video clips.
Here, Roshni is using an iPad. Several pictures have been taken of preferred items or activities that are available to Rosh. She scrolls through the pictures, taps on one, and then hands the iPad to her therapist, who now knows what Roshni wants. Before her therapist gives Roshni the requested item, she will be required to make a vocal approximation of the word, in this case, ball.
All right, come here. Woo, jump off, big jump. Very nice. What do you want?
I want to jump on the trampoline.
Go for it.
So in these videos, we've seen examples of manding, and a bit of intraverbal in the second video when the person asks the boy what he wants to do. This is also a good example of how the higher the verbal competence, the more the verbal operants can sort of overlap. So as we saw in the first video, the child's verbal repertoire is very limited, starting with non-vocal mundane, and the therapist does not provide an intraverbal, for example, doesn't ask. Rather, she prompts an echoic response to train it as a man.
Good.
My computer, my TV.
There you go. Good.
Got
Perfect.
bunny
Very nice.
and a cat.
Nice job, bud.
And this video is a good example of tacting. The child is naming the objects in the pictures.
Good job. Orange. Whoa! You got a lot of oranges. Orange. That was crazy. You're getting a lot of oranges. Here's your orange. Whoa!
This video is also an example of mundane. That is, of course, assuming that the child is hungry. As I mentioned earlier, deprivation is a key component.
When.
When?
Yeah. Say when.
When?
Good job. All right. What about this one? What does this say?
But.
It does say but. Good job. Give me 5.
This video exemplified echoic behavior at first and visual pairing with textual stimuli, and later a bit of intraverbal, in particularly in response to the instructor's instruction. What about this one? A good example of how verbal operants are more intertwined in verbally competent child in practice. And lastly, this is a tricky one, but try to guess what is going on in this case.
Hi Byron, how are you?
I'm happy. Are you pretty? You look good.
What are you doing today?
We stayed with the water over here at the moment and talked with the people for them over there. They're diving for them at the moment. They'll save in the moment. He'll have water very soon for him. With luck for him.
So we're on a cruise and we're about to
We
get to
will
Juneau.
store it right here and they'll save their hands right there for them.
And what were we just doing with the iPad?
Right at the moment they don't show a darn thing.
With the iPad that we were doing. Like here?
I'd like my change for me and change hands for me. It would happen. I would talk with Donna sometimes. We're out with them. Other people are working with them. I'm very happy with them.
Good.
This girl was very good.
Okay, some overview. So we've covered what is verbal behavior as initially defined by Skinner. We have defined, explained, and seen examples of different verbal operants, such as echoics, transcription, textual behavior, dictation taking, tacts, mands, and intraverbals. In what follows now, then we'll cover equivalence relations, which is a slightly more complex level of analysis when it comes to the way we relate events. Before we dive into equivalence relations, it's important to go over some key concepts. And we talk about the conditional discrimination when responding may be reinforced in the presence of a stimulus, but only in the presence of another stimulus. So here we have the classic experimental subjects, such as the white rat. If the rat presses the lever down, only in the presence of the light is not receiving a food pellet. However, if the rat presses the lever when both there's a tone and the light is on, then it would receive the food pellet. Another example of that would be a vendor machine. So usually when you approach a vendor machine, you'll press some buttons and you'll get an item back. However, in order for you to put in money and press the code, you would only do so if there's actually some items just inside the vendor machine, so there's no just the vendor machine as such. So we are applying a condition to that discriminative stimulus. Another example would be when a police officer is overriding the function of a discriminative stimulus. So usually we would stop on a red light, a traffic red light, but if there's an officer that indicates us that we can carry on, then we'll carry on regardless of the red light. So conditional discrimination is present in the matching to sample procedure. This is the procedure whereby we can establish equivalence relations that we'll cover in a second. So we have a training session in which there's a sample stimulus, usually presented in the center of the screen, and then we have two sample stimuli. On this condition, selecting the blue circle having as comparison and the blue circle will be reinforced. And then when we want to test, then we will present a sample stimulus and two comparison stimuli. And if the individual chooses a stimulus that has certain physical similarities to the comparison stimulus, then he will receive a reward. Bear in mind, this is a testing condition, so choosing specifically the green stimulus when we have a sample stimulus in color green has not been reinforced in the past. So in other words, it's almost as if the rule of choosing the stimulus that is similar to the sample stimulus has been transferred from training context to a testing context. The rule being abstracted here, so to speak, is choose the one that matches the color. There could also be occasions in which during a training session the stimulus choosing that is being reinforced is actually the one that is different with respect to the sample stimulus. So yet again, if we go onto a slightly different context in testing conditions and we have a triangle as a sample stimulus, the individual could roughly choose the one that differs with respect to the sample stimulus. That is, in this case, would be the square instead of the triangle. And so on and so forth with different types of relations that we might be training and then testing in different contexts. So what is equivalence relations? An equivalence relations is describing the relationships between stimuli that are functionally interchangeable. And to explain this, we go back to the matching to sample procedure. So let's suppose whenever I present the letter A, selecting the letter B among other comparison stimuli gets reinforced. And in the same way, whenever I present the letter A and the individual chooses C among C, X, Y, then that response gets reinforced. So in this case, if I were to reverse those relationships, that is, when I present the letter B, the individual would choose A among A, X, Y, that response would be correct and it would be reinforced. And in the same way, if I present Z as the sample stimulus, the individual will be correct if he chooses A among X, Y, and A. These relationships, backwards relationships, is what we refer to as symmetry. So there is a bit bidirectionality in the way these relationships are established. So the continuous arrow here is indicating that selecting B in the presence of A and C in the presence of A have been directly trained. However, the symmetric relationship, so selecting A in the presence of B and A in the presence of C, have been derived. In the same way, humans have the ability to derive relationships between stimuli that have been indirectly related. If I present the stimulus C, the individuals will choose B in the presence of other letters without having received any type of training, and vice versa. And because neither choosing B or C in the presence of one another have been reinforced in the past. This is an example of complex behavior, and this phenomenon is referred to as transitivity. There's also a type of response known as reflexivity, in which an individual will choose the one stimulus that is identical to that one among other distractors without having to receive any training. So Sidman, in his seminal paper, he was working with children with developmental disabilities whose language was also affected, and he was wondering whether he could teach these children with developmental problems to read. So he would present a spoken word and then reinforce, selecting the corresponding picture among other distractors. And in the same way, he would present the spoken form of a word, and then if the child selected the printed form of the corresponding word among other distractors, that behavior would be reinforced, and so on and so forth, in accordance to symmetry and transitivity type of relationships. And what would happen after this training is that the children were able to reverse and transfer the relationships as I explained. So Sidman suggested that the experimental training and the pre-experimental history of reinforcement produce a stimulus equivalence class. All the stimuli in a particular set would become functionally equivalent. A stimulus equivalence class then has three properties: reflexivity, that is the ability to match the stimulus to itself; symmetry; and transitivity, as I have just explained. So in Sidman's initial training, we will have an auditory stimulus such as the word car, pronounced car, and then the child would have to choose one of two comparison stimuli, and if the child chose the image with the car in it, that behavior would be reinforced. Then in the same way, at different trial, we would have the sound corresponding to the word book, and only the selection corresponding to the picture of the book would be reinforced. If the child chose the image with the car, upon hearing the word book, this response would go unreinforced. On a different set of trials, we would hear the word car again, but in this case, the comparison stimuli constituted written words. So if the child selected the corresponding written word to the one that has been just sounded, he or she would receive a reinforcer, whereas selecting any other comparison stimuli would go unreinforced. And after this initial training, then we would test for relationships that have not been trained directly. So this is testing. These are relationships that have not directly received any type of reinforcement. Upon presenting the image of a car, any response that selects the corresponding written word would be correct, whereas any other one would be incorrect. But because this is testing, those selections usually would not be reinforced. But it demonstrates the different type of relationships that have emerged as a consequence of preliminary training. So in this case, we have a written word as a sample stimulus, and the correct response would be to select the corresponding image, in this case the image of a car instead of the image of a book, and so on and so forth. In Sidman's study, novel behaviors were established in the absence of reinforcement, and yet they were predictable based on the training that the subjects have received. This ability to demonstrate relationships among stimuli that have not been directly trained seems to be only present in verbal organisms, or in other words, in humans. Studies have failed so far to show it in other type of animals. And this is why it is so important in contemporary psychology that addresses cognitive processes or verbal behavior. Given a history of training, untrained behavior is manifested. and that shows novelty, generative power of what we learned, and it's a key element to symbolic behavior. This phenomenon has been difficult to explain using other traditional behavioral concepts. Stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory, which was the theory developed after Sidman's work, complemented and expanded those initial formulations proposed by Skinner as a way to tackle language or verbal behavior. That ability to establish relationships among stimuli seems to be a key component to human language and cognition. In 1982, Sidman did a follow-up study in which he compared the performance of normally developing children with that of apes. He used 2 baboons and 2 rhesus monkeys, and only the human subjects were able to pass the performance criteria on tests for symmetry relationships. None of the other apes managed to perform above chance levels. Later in 2000, Dugdale and Liu implemented some methodological variations and tested whether 2 chimpanzees named Lana and Sherman would be able to demonstrate symmetry responding, but they were unable, as you could see it in the graph here. So stimulus equivalence that we've seen emerges in infancy and can combine multiple relations such as transitivity at least by 30 months of age. It also correlates with development of specific verbal skills and cognitive and verbal ability tests in normal children. So children who perform very well in these stimulus equivalence tests will have a high IQ. Now, we mentioned earlier that matching to sample procedure in this way produces a stimulus equivalence class, and one of the interesting phenomena of this is that once an equivalence class is formed, any behavioral function that is trained for one stimulus belonging to that class will generally transfer to the other members of the class. So if this is the class that is being formed and the derived relationships, and then if I pair stimulus B with an electric shock, remember by classic conditioning, stimulus B would acquire that emotional response. What is very interesting though is that A and C, by virtue of being class members, will also produce an emotional response, and of course this would not only give us insights into how psychological disorders can develop, but also a hint into how we could tackle behavioral problems that have been acquired in this way. Now, there are limitations to equivalence relations. The main one is that Sidman proposed an account of equivalence as a uniquely human ability that occurs in the context of certain types of reinforcement contingencies. But he didn't provide an explanation of how equivalence-like behavior or equivalencing developed. And equivalence relations theory does not explain other types of relations which are non-equivalent. For example, we can derive relationships that involve responding in terms of opposite, more or less than, or hierarchical, higher, lower, etc., etc. And this is what relational frame theory, a more contemporary theoretical development, focused on. But that's beyond the scope of these lectures. However, I do strongly encourage you to take a look at relational frame theory if you are interested in more complex theoretical approaches to human cognition and language from a psychological perspective, of course. As always, here are some references and some recommended readings on this topic, and I hope you have enjoyed this set of tutorials.